Hello guys, and welcome back to the History and Politics Vault with me, Ryan Gladman. Today is episode 4 of the Cold War series I'm doing on YouTube. It's for the Gcse syllabus, Edexcel, Superpower Relations and the Cold War topic. For further information about anything to do with the Cold War, I suggest reading some of this book, John Lewis Gaddis, The Cold War. It'll be in the description below, but it is a very interesting book with different perspectives on the Soviet Union and US side, with images as well to help understanding and it does actually offer analysis which maybe wasn't at the time available to people because it uses a lot of documents that were secret at the time and have been come out since then. So all these documents that Gaddis uses to analyse the Cold War may not be offered somewhere else, so I suggest reading that. I think it's about £10 on Amazon. If you are interested, I would suggest reading it. But anyway, today I hope everyone is okay, and another day of this COVID-19 situation and getting through it. So hopefully everyone is safe, keeping distance. But for today's video, we'll be moving on. So we looked last time at the 4 sort of laws and plans that were put in place by the Soviet Union and the US to try to move forward after World War II for their own gains, maybe. But today we're going to look at one policy that was established during the conferences that happened in the ending years of World War II, and focus more on the idea of Berlin and Germany being divided up into 4 zones. So as we said before, the Allies and the powers, so Russia or the Soviet Union, US and Britain, had all agreed to divide Berlin and Germany up into 4 zones. And Berlin was in the eastern part of Germany, which was a Soviet-controlled part of Germany. And Stalin did not want the Allies at all in Berlin, but it was decided that Berlin itself would be divided up into 4 zones, so there would be a part of Britain and the US within the Soviet-controlled territory of the whole of Germany. And in 1947, the US and British zones within that Berlin area, on the western side of Berlin, merged into one sort of area, and it was called Bizonia. So bi meaning 2. And that angered Stalin a lot because originally he didn't really want them in Berlin, and now they're working together in some hidden political way. So in June 1948, those 2 powers actually went ahead and planned to introduce a new Deutschmark in that area, and that new currency would affect the trade relations with the other areas within Berlin and in the eastern part of Germany. So on the 24th of June, which is later that month, Stalin accused the West of interfering in the Soviet zone, and he began to cut off all road, rail and canal traffic in the west part of Berlin. So those 2 zones, the US and the British zones, he began to cut off access from there to the western parts of Germany, which was a bit out of place for Stalin to do because it wasn't his territory. However, he was trying to show his anger towards the US and Britain for expanding their influence in Berlin, which to him was not allowed, and it shouldn't have been expanding so much eastwards. But Truman and Britain, the Truman US president and Britain, were determined to stand up against the Soviet Union and their mode of blocking the blockade, basically. That's why it's known as the Berlin blockade and airlift, because in the way to stand up against the blockade, Truman decided to airlift supplies over the borders, the brief contemporary borders that had been put up. So the airlift actually began on the 28th of June, 4 days after Stalin decided to start to blockade access to those parts, and it lasted 10 months. It was actually the biggest airlift in history, and at its peak, I think it was on the 16th and 17th of April, there was 1,398 flights and nearly 13,000 tons of supplies given to those western parts of Berlin in 24 hours. And that was one part of its success. The airlift was a massive success to keep Western Berlin progressing and stable, and Stalin recognised this, so actually he decided to end the blockade in May 1949, and he realised that his plan to stop the expansion of Western influence in Germany and Berlin failed. And because he recognised this, it's sort of his own fault, but sort of because of the success of the airlift, the East and West rivalry within Europe began to develop more, and it became a very, very clear divide. Because Truman saw it as a victory, but Stalin saw it as a massive failure for himself. And these divisions were actually confirmed when in May 1949 the Western Allies announced the Federal Republic of Germany in their zones, and that's in the western zone of Germany and the western parts of Berlin. Whereas Stalin, he responded to this by announcing that in October 1949 the Soviet zones became known as the German Democratic Republic. So now there are two officially different governments at work within Germany and controlled by different powers in Europe, and this was the first proper time there was an actual division, whereas before it's always been speculated and it's sort of a hypothetical division with political powers trying to outdo each other. Now there is actually an official political difference between different parts of Germany and Berlin, and this difference on the western side led to the creation of NATO. And this creation of NATO was basically the creation of different states in the western part of Europe, led by the US, and it was designed to prevent Soviet expansion by helping other countries in those areas who might be under the influence of Soviet communism. This was set up in April 1949, and NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the USA was leading this to show that they were wholeheartedly committed to the defence of Western Europe against the Soviet Union. And within 6 years, the Soviet Union actually responded by setting up the Warsaw Pact, which was the equivalent, basically the Eastern European countries that the Soviet Union had influence over. They actually cemented this influence by creating this pact, and it was the equivalent of NATO for the Soviet Union. So now we have two massive organisations of different countries, NATO and Warsaw Pact, against each other. So it's not just the Soviet Union against the US anymore. It has now become an official division between two organisations in Europe, and that division in Europe itself, East and West, became very, very apparent. And because this division became very, very apparent, the hostilities that arose from this were now permanent, and many countries either had to take to it and take to a side, or remain neutral. But remaining neutral was a dangerous thing to do, because eventually the Soviet Union would expand its influence, or there'll be the Western European powers would expand their influence. So every single country would in some way be affected by this division. And following the World War II, when the horrific battles were going on, and all those casualties and the effect that had, people were starting to wonder whether this is a new form of war. And actually that's why it's called the Cold War, because it was a new form of war. There wasn't much horrific casualties, there wasn't as many horrific casualties and battles, but the form of the war it had adopted was equally as impactful for many European countries. So the formation of NATO and later the Warsaw Pact basically cemented this idea that there is a European division, and the Berlin blockade and airlift was the first event that happened, which basically was the start of the Cold War in events. However, the earlier conferences made this Cold War apparent to some people, and now the Berlin blockade and airlift made it apparent to the whole of Europe. So yeah, this was basically the start of the active Cold War, and then in the next episode we'll be looking at the Warsaw Pact a bit more, and the arms race, which came out of this division. We'll be looking at that in episode 5, I believe. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe if you are new, leave a comment down below, and I'll probably see you again tomorrow at some stage. Thank you for watching.